Welcome to weekly unit number 7, an introduction to policy implementation and systems transformation. Prior to beginning this weekly unit, you should have just viewed the short video about labeling. The objectives for this weekly unit, which is broken into 3 parts, includes a discussion around labeling, stigma, and discrimination, and how these concepts have become the foundation for the consumer movement, and how the consumer movement has become a foundation for system transformation. The overview of this session includes that we're going to explore the foundations of the consumer movement that has led to transformation of mental health systems. And this foundation includes the concepts of labeling, stigma, and discrimination, and how these concepts have motivated individuals to act, that act being the consumer movement, and examples of the outcomes of the consumer movement. So SHI Chapter 29 is a chapter around labeling, stigma, and discrimination. And the chapter starts out with a discussion around labeling as the basis for stigma. And the discussion includes 2 arguments from 2 different authors around labeling, thus the labeling debate. And one person argues that labeling itself may actually cause mental illness. And the other person argues that there's actually a modified labeling theory, which is that labeling itself may not be a direct cause for mental illness, but that it does create disadvantages for people and adds to uncomfortable situations because people worry about what other people think. Now, labeling activates beliefs that lead to negative consequences. So SHI talks about the package deal, in that labeling can be both positive and negative. Positive in the fact that there's a desire to provide more benefits to individuals who have mental illness in an effort to reduce stigma associated with that illness. But it also is negative in that individuals who are receiving services are often stigmatized, and therefore that negates the positiveness. So for example, if I were to receive mental health services, I may most likely walk into a mental health clinic. The mere act of walking into the mental health clinic can be perceived by both me as an individual and by others as a form of stigma, because walking through that door indicates that I need to receive services for mental illness. In fact, studies are very clear that individuals would rather receive behavioral health services through their primary care clinic because there is not stigma or less stigma associated with walking into your primary care clinic in order to receive those services. So out of labeling grows the concept of stigma. And so research shows that stigma reduces access to services for the very reasons that I just talked about in the example of walking into a mental health clinic versus a primary care clinic. So using that as an example, can we use that to define stigma? Sure, because walking in that door, I've been marked as an individual who needs to receive some types of services for a mental illness. Therefore, I am now marked or labeled as mentally ill. And we link that to stereotypes that exist within our own thought process. Because that individual has walked into a mental health clinic, therefore they must be mentally ill. And therefore, I may not want to associate with them because there's something about them that may cause me concerns around my safety. And so that stereotype resulting from a label of being mentally ill, that I associate that with something that may be a concern for my safety, and the fact that I don't want to associate with that person because of my concern for safety, I have now discriminated against that individual. Now, when we think about modified labeling theory, in that labeling itself may not directly result in a mental illness, it certainly can create disadvantages that make us uncomfortable. And so with stigma itself causes an emotional response that the consumer can sense, and it creates shame for the consumer. And therefore, shame is a negative consequence. So as a result, stigma can cause almost like an internal discrimination for an individual. So stigma is really, it's the convergence of labeling, stereotyping, and discriminating. So there's this survey called the General Social Survey. It's a survey that's conducted on the national level on a regular basis that measures public opinion about a number of issues. And one of the issues that it is looked at are issues associated with mental illness. And as you can see on the slide here, between 1950 and 1996, a key stereotype that emerged from the survey related to mental illness is that folks associate mental illness with violence, and that this has increased over time. So we can see in 1950, the General Social Survey found that about 12% of respondents associated mental illness with violence. But then by just 1996, that number had grown to 31% associating mental illness with violence. So in 2006, public attitudes have changed quite a bit, in that stigma has been reduced because the public has begun to associate mental illness more with a biological or medical type of illness rather than something that folks less understand. In other words, by the public associating mental illness with something they are more familiar with it, then stigma is reduced. So stigma affects the mentally ill in a number of ways. The most common being the limitation of access to services. And the primary example of that being the one that I used earlier about the individual walking into the mental health clinic. That very action itself can be stigmatizing. And since individuals don't want to be stigmatized, then they're less likely to take actions that would result in stigmatization. And therefore, they would be less likely to walk through the doors of the clinic. Now, hierarchy of status, or status hierarchy, really means that when we stigmatize or stereotype individuals, we naturally associate them with a category that for some reason we would rather not associate with. So an example of that is a common stereotype that has occurred over the ages, is that we often associate the less fortunate with being less healthy, in that the less fortunate could be, we would not want to associate with them. This is actually a historical stereotype. We would not want to associate with them because they're more likely to be carriers of illness or disease because of their socioeconomic status. And merely by observing their appearance, we are able to naturally, automatically stereotype them in a way, and our mind says to us, we really don't want to associate with them in order to protect ourselves. So this is like a survival mechanism. So when you think of hierarchy of status, we're really talking about how individuals fall out in their socioeconomic status in relation to the rest of society. Now, stigma also affects the mentally ill through discrimination, and let's further define that. So discrimination can result in, obviously, the discrimination against an individual because we have labeled them and we've, as a result, stigmatized them. Now we're treating them differently than we would treat others. So the most common form of stereotype or discrimination that we would think of on the individual basis is us versus them. Now discrimination can discrimination can also result in internal stigma. In other words, the individual internalizes stigma because they feel shame. Discrimination can also be interactional in that we treat people as they are perceived because we have labeled them in such a way that we automatically treat them in a certain way. And then there's also structural discrimination in that we are able to perpetuate discrimination through various levels in society because we may actually write that discrimination into social policy, we may write it into law, or we may write it into institutional practice. So now we're going to just take a break in this particular presentation and watch the next video, and then come back to part 2 of weekly unit number 7.